Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this final episode of the British Kings and Queens. This book contains an interesting little addendum of the Scottish monarchy and also of the Welsh monarchy. So I look forward to sharing with you perhaps some lesser-known details of the monarchs of these countries within the United Kingdom. Let's start. Lovely images already. So we have right back in time again to 810. Kenneth I MacAlpin, the Pictish king. Kenneth MacAlpin is a king of myth, as much as known fact, and even his ancestry is disputed. He may have been a Gaul or a Pict. He was the son, it seems, of King Alpin, and became king on his father's death in 839. He rose to power following a great battle against the Vikings in 839 when the Pictish king Llewellyn and almost all of his relatives and nobles died, leaving a power vacuum. There were 4 contenders for the crown for the surviving members of the royal house. The initial victor was Stuart, but then Kenneth defeated the Picts in the battle in 841. Legend then says they got together at Scone, where they all got drunk, before Kenneth and his Scots turned on the Picts and killed them, eliminating all other contenders for the throne. Kenneth was crowned king of the Picts and Scots in 843, the first king of the House of Alpin, and the stronghold was at Fort of Ward, near present-day Perth. So the 11th century chronicle of the Kings of Alba, of which only one copy survives and resides in Paris, I'd like to get my hands on that, says Kenneth was constantly under attack from Vikings, and he even captured Melrose and burned Dunbar. And in any event, the remaining Picts wanted their home back and continued fighting, but by 855, Kenneth was firmly in control of all northern Scottish lands not held by the Vikings. Thanks to the Viking raids and their extensive settlements across all the Scottish islands, mainland Scotland and Kenneth's kingdom were almost completely cut off and isolated from Ireland, southern England and continental Europe. This had the result of strengthening the relationship between the Picts and the Gauls to eventually unite them as one people, the Alba. In February 858, Kenneth died from the effects of a tumour at the panels of Balliol, and he was buried on Iona. He left at least 2 sons and 2 daughters, but was succeeded by his brother Donald, who became Donald I. So Donald was the younger son of King Alpin II and brother of Kenneth MacAlpin. Very little is known about him other than he was a vigorous soldier. During his short reign, he consolidated his hold over the throne by suppressing all Pictish attempts to regain the crown, and he also introduced the laws of oath, which included the law of tapestry, which essentially ensured that when the king died, the next king would be elected, so the crown would pass to the most able member of the family, somebody who had the strength and wisdom to protect the kingdom, and not to a young son unable to fight and rule. So over the following 150 years or so, the rule ensured that the crown alternated between the 2 increasingly distant lines of the House of Alpin, with the result of increasingly strained relations and the frequent murder of crown's incumbents. Donald died at the palace of Kinballiol in Perthshire in 862, and the Chronicle of Melrose alone says he was assassinated after reigning for 4 years and was buried on Iona. His elected successor was his nephew Constantine I, who was elected by the law of tapestry, and the son of Kenneth, and the nephew of his predecessor Donald. Throughout his reign, he was fighting to consolidate and expand the kingdom of Alba, and this was a period of great Viking raids, yet he was a match for them. Defeated first in the mid-860s, Olaf the White, then Thorstein the Red in battle. His southern rival was Artgal, the king of Strathclyde, who died in 872 at the hands of Vikings, possibly when Constantine refused to pay for his ransom, and then placed his brother-in-law on the throne, and in the process made Strathclyde a subordinate kingdom to Alba. The Vikings returned in strength from Dublin and Yorkshire in 877 and landed in Fife, where they established a settlement from which they could raid the eastern seaboard of Scotland. The same year, Constantine and his men met the Vikings at Inverdovat in northeast Fife. He was killed in battle and buried in Iona. We have Donald II, who was the son of Constantine I, overlooked for the crown when Eochaid and Giric took the throne. Donald was later asked, or perhaps ordered, to kill Giric by Eochaid. Donald duly dispatched Giric at Dundurn, near St. Finian's, but returned to exile, Icade, to Gwynedd in Wales. Donald took for himself the crowns of the Picts and the Scots, and of Strathclyde, and in the process became known as the King of Alba, instead of being the King of the Picts and Scots. Became the first Scottish king to be recorded as fighting against the Highlanders. Donald's contemporary was Sigurd the Mighty, the ravaging Viking who took for himself most of northern Scotland. Donald was killed by the Danes at the Battle of Dunnottar, near Montrose, and was buried on Iona. Constantine II was the son of King VIII, succeeded as the king of the Picts and Scots on the death of his cousin Donald. He too inherited a land ravaged by the Vikings, but in 904 at the Battle of Scone, his victory drove the raiders out of mainland Scotland. The first and second battles of Corbridge in 914 and 18 soundly defeated the Vikings who had settled in Northumberland. With the threat of the Vikings diminished, Constantine was able to turn his attention to governing his realm, started the system of Mormaer, in which sub-kings or earls were responsible for the protection and running of parts of his kingdom. He also ordered the church to become more Gaelic in character. In 927, and then again in 934, Constantine submitted to King Aethelstan of England to secure some sort of peace in the south, and that's, I think, where our two timelines converge. The Vikings hadn't gone away altogether, but they'd made considerable numbers in Dublin. So to improve the prospects of peace, 937, Constantine married his daughter to Olaf III Guthruthson, the Viking king in Dublin. The combined army of Strathclyde Britons and Vikings invaded England in 937 and met the English army of King Aethelstan at the Battle of Brunberg, where they were soundly defeated. One of Constantine's sons, Killak, was among the dead. As a result of the heavy defeat, the Scots abandoned Lothian, including Edinburgh, to Northumbrian rule. The battle is significant for establishing the approximate border between England and Scotland. In 943, at the age of about 69, Constantine abdicated the throne after 43 years so that Malcolm I could succeed him. He withdrew to Caldee Monastery at St. Andrew's, Fife, where he became a monk and died there in 952, probably buried there as well. We now have Malcolm I, and this is a reenactment of the Battle of Moray in 954 when the Earl of Killak led a revolt against Malcolm I. So Malcolm was the son of Donald, and he was nicknamed Unbolredruk, meaning dangerous red. His intelligent leadership won him a reputation for wisdom and became an ally of King Edmund I of England in their mutual fight against the scourge of Viking raiders. In 945, Edmund had expelled Olaf Sigurdsson and his Vikings from Northumbria, devastated Cumbria so the land would be of no use, and blinded the two sons of Donald II, because a blind man could not be a warrior leader. To help keep the Vikings away, Edmund then allied himself with a male and let him the province of Strathclyde by way of reward, and this alliance was probably renewed with King Eadred, Edmund's successor to the English throne. In 948, Eric Bloodaxe took York, but he was quickly driven out by Edred before Olaf Sigurdsson took the city again in 949. Perhaps as part of the agreement, Mael raided south against King Anlaf right across Northumbria as far as the River Tees, taking many people and herds of cattle in the process. In 952, a battle was reported in the Ulster Chronicle between the Man of Alba and the Britons of Strathclyde, and the English against the Norsemen. In 954, the men of Moray, led by Earl Killak, revolted against Mael, but were quickly suppressed and Killak killed. However, the problem was not thoroughly dealt with. One of Killak's followers assassinated Malcolm at Oldham. He was buried alongside his predecessors on Iona. We then have Duncan I. That's an image there of Malcolm I. But Duncan I succeeded to the throne without opposition because he was the grandson of Malcolm, who had fathered no sons, and very little is known about him, except he appears as a greatly fictionalised figure in William Shakespeare's Macbeth. Of course, Duncan is assassinated at the hands of Macbeth in that play. Donald married in 1030, but the chronicles disagree about his wife. She might have been called Suthen, or being a cousin of Earl Seward Bjornsson of Northumbria. However, in time, two of their sons became kings. In 1039, Duncan led his army into England, where he besieged Durham, but they were soundly beaten. Duncan managed to escape. The following year, Duncan was challenged for the crown by Macbeth, who, with his ally, Earl Thorfinn of Orkney, made a bid for power. The three men met in battle at Pitgavany near Elgin in August 1040, and Donald was killed. So in reality he was actually killed in battle, not murdered in his sleep by Macbeth. But Macbeth, of course, became legendary thanks to William Shakespeare. And Macbeth was the son of Finlay, sub-king of Moray, and the grandson of Malcolm. He became sub-king of Moray when his cousin died, perhaps murdered, in 1032, and then married his widow, Princess Gruach, the great-granddaughter of Kenneth, and became stepfather to her son Llewellyn, a possible rival for the throne of Alba, who was ambitious for his cousin Duncan's throne, about the only thing that Shakespeare got right, and by 1040 had allied with another cousin, Earl Thorfinn of Orkney. The three met in battle near Elgin in August 1040, and Duncan was killed, leaving Macbeth uncontested. Duncan's wife and children fled to safety. Macbeth established his rule and stabilised the country, which allowed the economy to improve. All contemporary chronicles have nothing but praise for his reign. Only later works branded him a tyrant. He even made a pilgrimage to Rome for a few months in 1050, where it was noted that he was generous to the poor. And during the English battles between Edward the Confessor and Godwin, Earl of Wessex, Macbeth sheltered various Norman exiles from harm. It has been suggested that they introduced him to the concept of feudalism. By 1054, Edward was ready to act and sent Stuart, Earl of Northumbria, with a large army to invade Scotland. Duncan's son Malcolm are aligned with the Earl of Northumbria, and together they took and occupied much of southern Scotland. Macbeth met the invaders in August 1057, when he was beaten in the last stand at the Battle of Lumparnon, Aberdeenshire, and mortally wounded by the future Malcolm III. He either died there or 60 miles away at Scone a few days later. Macbeth was buried on Iona and became the last of the Alba kings to rest there. We now have Malcolm III. He was the son of Duncan I and the first king of the house of Dunkeld. He was only about 9 when his father was murdered by Macbeth, and went with his mother and siblings for revenge to his relatives in Northumbria. King Edward the Confessor of England supported his claim to his father's throne and invaded South Scotland in 1053, where Malcolm and the Earl of Northumbria joined his army, which then of course met and killed Macbeth at the Battle of Lumparnon. Macbeth's stepson Llewellyn was king for a year before being killed by Malcolm, who had then become king himself, and was crowned at Scone in 1058. Malcolm's first wife was Ingeborg, and they had 3 sons before she died, and Malcolm remarried in 1070. His second wife, Margaret, was the great niece of his ally Edward the Confessor, and had sought refuge in Scotland with a group of English exiles, including her brother Edgar the Atheling, when William the Conqueror had taken the English throne. They had 8 children together, who significantly were given Anglo-Saxon names. Margaret, who was later canonised as St. Margaret of Scotland, introduced many changes to the language at court, changed from Gaelic to Anglo-Saxon, one effect of which was that Malcolm was the first monarch to be called the King of Scotland. Furthermore, Margaret promoted the establishment of the Roman Catholic Church in Scotland over the existing Celtic Church. So done a huge amount of work religiously to change the religious landscape of Scotland, it seems. Malcolm was happy to disrupt the Norman conquest of England, using the excuse of attempting to get his brother-in-law Edgar the Atheling his rightful throne, and to this end he made repeated invasions of northern England, but was driven back each time, until 1072, when he was forced to sign the Treaty of Abernethy and submit to the Conqueror. Malcolm invaded England again after William died, but was killed instead in Northumberland at the Battle of Alnwick on November the 13th, 1093. He was 62 and had ruled for 35 years. His eldest son from his second marriage, Prince Edward of Scotland, also died there. Malcolm's widow Margaret died 3 days later after hearing of their deaths. Here's an image of their wedding, and a coin issued showing Alexander I, who was the 4th son of Malcolm III and St. Margaret, and brother-in-law of Henry I of England. He was called Alexander the Fierce. He was a generally pious king. He founded the abbeys at Scone and Dunkeld. Alexander carried out terrible reprisals on his enemies from Moray and Mearns for daring to challenge him. In 1114, he led part of Henry I's campaign against the Welsh, and later married his illegitimate daughter Sibylla. He died in Stirling in 1124. So he seemed to have burnt fierce and brightly for a short time. Alexander III succeeded his father to the throne of Scotland, aged 8, leaving the government during his minority to a series of feuding nobles. Aged 21 in 1262, he took the reins and immediately laid claim to the Western Isles, his father's particular cause from King Haakon of Norway, which he eventually got along with the Isle of Man via the Treaty of Perth, 1266. Norway kept Orkney and Shetland, and in 1251 Alexander married Margaret of England, the daughter of King Henry III, and together they had 3 children before she died in 1274. All his children predeceased him, so he made Margaret the Maid of Norway his heir. Alexander remarried in 1285 to Yolande de Dreux, but died aged 44 after falling from his horse during appalling weather in Fife in 1286. Here is a late 18th century rendition of Colin Fitzgerald saving Alexander III from a stag. It's an incredibly dramatic image. In the coronation of Alexander III on Moot Hill in Scone, the royal poet is saying, "God bless the King of Scotland." So Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was the heiress to her grandfather, the childless Alexander III, and a Norwegian princess. Her claim was to her mother Margaret, the daughter of Alexander III of Scotland. Her father was King Eric II of Norway. When Alexander died in 1286, she became queen, aged 3, and guardians were appointed to rule for her. Robert Bruce, the 5th Lord of Annandale, and his son Robert, the father of King Robert Bruce, raised rebellion in southwest Scotland. The other contender was John Balliol. King Edward I supported Mairead's claim, or Margaret's claim, probably intending to marry his son Edward, Prince of Wales, to her. Negotiations between all the interested parties continued, while Margaret, then aged 7, started making her way to Scotland to be crowned queen. She died suddenly at Kirkwall in Orkney in 1290. Her body was taken back to Norway and buried in Bergen. She was the last of the Calmore dynasty, and for the following 6 years there was no monarch, while the 13 principal contenders fought for the throne. We now have John de Balliol here, with Queen Isabella in the royal arms of Scotland, from an English manuscript around 1330. So John de Balliol was the son of wealthy English and Scottish nobles. Laid claim to the Scottish throne through being the maternal great-great-great-grandson of David I. When King Edward I of England was asked by the Scottish lords in 1291 to arbitrate in the great cause between the various claimants to the throne, he chose John de Balliol. He was crowned the following year, but proved little more than an English puppet. Because of this, a council was appointed to rule in his stead, and the council concluded a treaty of mutual alliance between Scotland and France, England's historic enemy, and started the Old Alliance. The wars of Scottish independence started when a furious Edward marched his army north, and after taking Dunbar, John was forced to abdicate in 1296. Taken to London and imprisoned in the Tower of London before being allowed to seek shelter in France, he eventually settled in his family estates at Helicourt in Picardy, where he died in 1314. And here we have another image from an English manuscript of Robert the Bruce with his wife Queen Isabel. The powerful Bruce family laid claim to the Scottish throne since the early 13th century, and on his father's side he was Norman Scottish, and on his mother's Scots Gael. Robert Bruce was the first child of Robert de Bruce, 6th Lord of Annandale, and Marjorie, Countess of Carrick, and claimed the throne of Scotland as a 4th-generation great-grandson of David I. Despite this ancestry, the Bruce family claim to the throne of Scotland, in the person of Robert de Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale, had been passed over in favour of John Balliol in 1292. In 1296, Robert Bruce and a number of powerful Scottish nobles revolted against the English rule of Edward I. However, the English king prevailed in battle and forced the nobles to swear to the capitulation of Irvine in 1297 that established their fealty to Edward in return for their pardon and exclusion from service overseas. Scottish resistance continued in September 1297, following the victory of Stirling Bridge, when William Wallace and Andrew de Moray defeated the English forces. Bruce changed sides to support the Scottish cause, yet afterwards he was one of the few Scottish nobles who did not have his lands confiscated by Edward I. Here he is at the Battle of Bannockburn, a great victory against the English. Wallace was defeated at the Battle of Falkirk in 1297 and resigned as Guardian of Scotland, and in his place Robert Bruce and John Comyn of Badenoch were made joint guardians. This was never going to work because the two families were sworn enemies and continued a generations-long feud for control of Scotland and the throne. Accordingly, in 1299, a third neutral guardian, William Lamberton, Bishop of St Andrews, was appointed, but Bruce resigned the following year. In 1295, Robert had married Isabella of Mar, the daughter of the Earl of Mar, but she died within about 5 years after giving birth to their daughter Margaret. So in 1302, he remarried to Elizabeth de Burgh, daughter of the Earl of Ulster, and they had 4 children together. In January 1302, a truce was signed between Edward I of England and the Scottish nobles, including Bruce, who changed sides again, pledging themselves to the English king. In 1303, Edward I invaded Scotland yet again. Following a successful campaign, all the Scottish nobles, with the exception of William Wallace, submitted to him in 1304. English rule was established over Scotland, and all immediate resistance disappeared with the capture and execution of William Wallace in August 1305. Robert Bruce had become the second most powerful noble in Scotland, with huge estates scattered around the country, plus some English holdings, and a good claim to the throne. However, his bitter rival John Comyn was even more powerful, with more extensive estates and higher placed relatives, in addition to a very strong claim on the throne. Among most Scots, the latter was preferred for being loyal to their cause, unlike Robert, who, for political expediency, continually swapped sides, with the result that neither the English nor the Scots entirely trusted him. It said here that the heart of Robert the Bruce lies here at Melrose Abbey. In February 1306, Bruce and John Comyn met under truce on neutral ground in the church of the Greyfriars in Dumfries to discuss the situation. The agreement got heated until Bruce stabbed and badly wounded Comyn in front of the high altar. Bruce left swiftly, telling his supporters, including Roger de Kilpatrick, what had happened, and 2 of them went back into the church to finish Comyn off. In the light of events, Bruce had no option but to continue his plans to revolt. He moved first to wipe out the main opposition and went against the Commons in southern Scotland. He then needed support from the Scottish Church, so he confessed his crime to the Bishop of Glasgow, who granted him absolution on condition that Bruce would respect the Church when he became king. Robert the Bruce was crowned Robert I at Scone in March 1306, and Scotland was plunged into civil war as the Comyn family opposed Bruce's rule. Edward I, eager to destabilise Scotland further, supported the Commons with his army and persuaded Pope Clement V to excommunicate Bruce for the murder of John Comyn. After losing 2 battles, many of Bruce's supporters were dead. Most of his family members were killed or imprisoned, and his wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, was not killed but imprisoned in Yorkshire because she was the daughter of an ally of Edward's, but his mistress, Isabella, Countess of Buchan, was confined in an open cage over the battlements of Berwick Castle. Robert, meanwhile, went into hiding through the winter of 1306-07, probably on Rathlin Island off the Irish coast. He returned to Scotland in February 1307. After a couple of skirmishes, his army of 600 defeated the English army of 3,000 at Loudon Hill, and with this he won popular support across Scotland. Then in July 1307, Edward I died near Solway Firth, and the English lost their driving force as his less capable son became King Edward II. Robert the Bruce continued his guerrilla tactics across southern Scotland, attacking the Commons and their supporters in particular, but also his other enemies, and anyone who supported the English. Castle after castle fell to him. In May 1308, his army devastated Buchan, burning every village and killing every Comyn they found. They took Aberdeen and slaughtered the English garrison, and then turned to take the last Comyn stronghold, Dunstafnage Castle. By the end of that year, Robert Bruce controlled almost all of northern Scotland, and a year later controlled all Scotland north of the River Tay. 1309 saw the clergy finally accepting Robert Bruce as King of Scotland, and he held his first parliament that March. Over the next 5 years he recaptured strongholds from English hands: Linlithgow, Dumbarton, Perth, Roxburgh, as well as constant plundering raids over the English border. However, the English still held Stirling Castle despite a prolonged siege. In 1314, Edward II took his army of 20,000 soldiers into Scotland, where they encountered an army of 7,000 Scots at Bannockburn on June the 24th, 1314. After desperate fighting on both sides, the Scots prevailed. The English tried to flee, and many of their knights were slaughtered. Edward II only just managed to escape. Bruce captured the Earl of Hereford, who he exchanged for his wife, sister and daughter. Scottish raids continued over the border with even greater success. On April 6, 1320, the Scots declared their independence with the Declaration of Arbroath, and this document announced their nationhood under King Robert I and was sent to Pope John the 22nd, who arranged a truce with England, and peace talks started the following year. Although the talks broke down and the Scottish rates resumed, the Pope formally accepted Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland. Edward II died, probably murdered, and Edward III became King of England. The rates continued until in March 1328, when the Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton, was sealed. Edward renounced all English claims to sovereignty over Scotland, and Robert, in return, paid England 20,000 marks compensation for damage done during the border raids into England. To seal the treaty, a marriage was arranged between Bruce's 4-year-old son David, the future David II, and Edward III's 7-year-old sister, Joan of England. Very strange, isn't it? The marriage ceremony was held in July 1328, and Robert the Bruce died a little less than a year later on June 7, 1329 at Dumbarton, from what was described as an unclean ailment. He was buried at Dunfermline Abbey. An unconfirmed legend says that his heart was removed and taken on crusade as far as Granada in Spain, and returned some years later to be buried with him. Here is a statue of Robert the Bruce at Stirling Castle, a very famous Scottish monarch. His successor David II, as we know, had married very, very young, and they were sent to France, where they spent the following years in exile while Edward Balliol was King of Scotland. David returned to Scotland to rule in his own name when his followers were victorious in 1341. And in 1346, to honour his commitment to the Old Alliance, he invaded England, but following defeat at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, he was captured and taken back to England for the next 11 years. Following the Treaty of Berwick-upon-Tweed in 1357, and on the agreement of a ransom of 100,000 marks, he returned to Scotland. However, only part of the money was handed over, so David was offered to make Edward III his heir instead. David died in Edinburgh Castle in 1371, left no children, so ended the male line of the House of Bruce. And there is David II of Scotland and Edward III of England agreeing the Treaty of Berwick. Doesn't look very happy. We have Robert II here in the House of Stuart, the first king here of the House of Stuart, and was the son of Walter Stuart and Margaret Bruce, daughter of Robert I. While Robert I's son, David of Bruce, resigned, Robert Stuart became a leading martial noble fighting for the Scottish king and was one of the regents in charge of the kingdom, while David II lived for safety in France. When the regents fell out with each other, Robert became sole regent and controlled the situation so well that David was able to return to his throne in 1341. But when David was captured after the Battle of Neville's Cross and confined to England, Robert, who had escaped from the battle, was once again regent. In 1363, Robert suspected that David was making Edward III of England his heir, and he revolted. He was caught and quickly released, and soon after declared king when David died without leaving children. Crowned in March 1371, aged 55, and reigned for 19 years. A riding accident saw his health deteriorate markedly, and the Scottish Parliament appointed his second son, Robert, Earl of Fife, as his heir in 1389. He died at Dundonald in 1390 and fathered 21 children, not all of them legitimate thanks to the laws of consanguinity. 21 children. James I, who was the son of Robert III and Annabella Drummond, and while a child was sent to France for his own safety to keep him away from jealous relatives, but he was captured and handed over to Henry IV of England, who demanded a ransom for his return. James' father died in 1406, rumour said from grief, and his uncle Robert Stuart became regent, but failed to find the ransom money for James's release, although he did for his own son. James remained a hostage in England for the next 18 years, and when Robert Stuart died in 1420, the Scottish nobles raised the £40,000 ransom and secured his return in 1424. Meanwhile, James married Joan Beaufort, a cousin of Henry VI, and they had 8 children. On his return, James had his uncle's family executed and ruthlessly set about ordering his chaotic kingdom. The clan feuds in the Highlands were worse than ever, and the border barons uncontrollable, making numerous financial and legal reforms. He also renewed the Old Alliance in 1428, but as time progressed, questions about his legitimacy arose, and James was assassinated in front of his wife by a group of 8 Scottish nobles, led by Sir Robert Graham at the Friars Preachers Monastery in Perth. Queen vowed revenge, and soon the killers were hunted down and tortured before being executed. Here's James I spending 18 years as a hostage in England and only returned home with an English bride after a huge ransom. And he was an effective monarch who organised much of the workings of early Scottish government. James II, who was the younger of twin sons of James I of Scotland and Joan Beaufort, whose brother died in infancy, became king at the age of 7 when his father was assassinated in 1437. His father's usurpers, particularly Walter Stuart, 1st Earl of Atholl, tried to capture the throne, but were executed within months. And between 1437 and 1439, Archibald Douglas, the 5th Earl of Douglas, ruled as regent, and died of his. When he died, a series of other Scottish nobles attempted to rule and power swap from noble to noble. In 1449, James came into his majority, but continued to struggle against a number of Scottish nobles, especially the Douglases, for power. Then in 1452, at Stirling Castle, James stabbed the 8th Earl of Douglas to death, causing intermittent civil war for the next 3 years. The Douglases were finally defeated at the Battle of Arkinholm in May 1455, and those who survived fled to exile in England, and all Douglas lands were confiscated, mostly to the Crown. James wasn't seriously challenged again. In 1460, during the successful siege of Roxburgh Castle, still in English hands, a cannon exploded and killed James II. He was 29, and he was known as the James of the Fiery Face because of a birthmark. And here we have James III, very powerful stained glass window image here. He became king at the age of 9 on the death of his father James II, and his mother Mary of Guelders ruled as regent until she died in 1463. He was crowned in 1460 at Kelso Abbey. So in 1469 he took his full royal authority and married Princess Margaret of Denmark. And when her dowry from her father, King Christian of the First of Denmark, defaulted, he acquired for the Scottish crown Orkney and Shetland in compensation. James became estranged from his brothers, the Duke of Albany and John, Earl of Mar, who despised James' love of the arts and his cordial relations with England. In 1479, Mar died in suspicious circumstances, and Albany fled to England, then France, as their supporters scattered. By 1486, James was an isolated figure living in Stirling Castle. 2 years later, at the Battle of Sochie-Burn, James was thrown from his horse and died. Alternatively, the story goes that while lying injured in a nearby cottage, a priest came to shrive him, but instead stabbed him to death. Oh dear. Here we have James IV, who was the last British king killed in battle at the Battle of Flodden Field in 1513. Here he is on horseback, looking very gallant. So during the Second Popular Rebellion against his father, James III, 15-year-old James was proclaimed as their leader. When James III was killed at the Battle of Sochie-Burn, James became king and proved a much better ruler than his father, although his own interest in administration and justice stabilised the kingdom. Additionally, he established peace with England with the Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1502 with Henry VII, which also authorised his marriage to Margaret Tudor, the marriage of the Thistle and the Rose in 1503. He also built the Scottish Navy and was a great patron of the arts and sciences. In 1513, when Henry VIII of England joined the Holy Alliance and invaded France, James, constrained by the Old Alliance to support France, declared war on England and invaded. At the subsequent Battle of Flodden Field in September 1513, many Scottish nobles were killed alongside King James, the last British monarch to die in battle. He was also the last Scottish king known to have spoken Scottish Gaelic. Here's the large-scale stained glass window at the south end of Parliament Hall, which depicts the inauguration of the Quarter Session by King James V in 1532. And here is James IV and Queen Margaret, daughter of Henry VII of England. So James V became King of Scotland, aged 1, after his father James IV was killed at the Battle of Flodden Field in 1513, and for 1 year. His English mother Margaret Tudor ruled as regent, but the Scottish nobles deposed her when she remarried in 1514. So their choice of regent was the Duke of Albany, James's stepfather. The 6th Earl of Angus was soon divorced by Margaret, but he kidnapped young James and held him in captivity for 2 years while he tried to corrupt him with luxuries and gifts and ruled on his behalf. Despite this, James hated him and managed to escape in 1528 and became king on his own. He exacted revenge on his opponents, especially the Earl of Angus, whom he exiled. And although he married twice, none of his illegitimate children survived infancy, although his 9 or so illegitimate children were fine. And after failing to meet his uncle King Henry VIII as arranged at York in 1542, James had to march south with his army to counter the furious English king's invasion force. The Battle of Solway Moss in November 1542 was a heavy defeat for the Scots. Already ill, he suffered a complete nervous breakdown, took to his bed at Falkland Palace with a fever, where he heard the dispiriting news that his wife had borne a daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, and 6 days later, fearing the Stuart dynasty failed, he died. Of course, we have now the famous Mary, Queen of Scots, who was born in Linlithgow Palace in West Lothian to James V and Mary of Guise, and became Queen of Scotland at 6 days old when her father died of cholera without other heirs. She was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII of England, which made her next in line to the throne after King Henry VIII's children. And to secure her and Scotland's future, the Scottish nobles agreed a marriage between Mary and Henry VIII's son Edward, the future King Edward VI, in the Treaties of Greenwich. However, the Scottish Catholic nobles and her mother Mary of Guise were opposed to an English Protestant alliance with their young queen and spirited her off to Stirling Castle. Henry VIII was furious at the change of policy and ordered the Rough Wooing, a series of savage raids across the border into Scotland. Crops were burned across the Tweed Valley, and the abbeys of Jedburgh, Dryburgh, Melrose, Holyrood House were burned down. The Scots appealed to the French for help, and Henry II proposed a marriage between 5-year-old Mary and his 3-year-old son, the Dauphin of France, Francis. The marriage treaty was agreed in 1548. August that same year, Mary, Queen of Scots, and a small retinue of courtiers was sent to live at the French court, and remained there for 13 years, during which time she was well educated and became a popular member of court. She changed the spelling of her name during this period from Stuart to the more French Stuart, with a U, and the marriage took place in Paris in April 1558. And the following year, Francis succeeded his father to the throne, and Mary became Queen Consort of France. However, within 2 years, Francis died of an ear infection, aged 17. Mary became a widow in 1560. In August 1561, and against all advice, Catholic Mary returned to her Scottish throne, despite Scotland having officially converted to Protestantism following John Knox's reforms. She'd been assured that she would be allowed to worship as she wished, and initially her return was welcomed, and with the advice of her chief adviser, Lord James Stuart, her reign was uncontroversial. 4 years into her return, Mary married her second cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who was, as was Mary, a great-grandchild of King Henry VII of England. Darnley was a disastrous choice. He wanted to be treated as the king, and his arrogance quickly made enemies, and conspirators were only too happy to use them for their own ends. Then, in March 1566, at Holyrood House Palace, Darnley burst into the heavily pregnant Queen's chamber, threatened her, and in a jealous rage murdered her secretary, David Riccio, before her eyes. Terrible. Their son James was born in June that summer, but their relationship had irretrievably broken down, as I'm sure it would, when Darnley was murdered. Darnley was murdered just outside Edinburgh in February 1567. Mary was widely suspected of complicity. When Mary married James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell, the prime suspect in the murder, her remaining credibility vanished. Her Protestant nobles raised an army against her, and when they met Mary and Bothwell at Carberry Hill in June 1567, she had no choice but to surrender. She was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle and forced to abdicate in favour of her 1-year-old son James. Bothwell fled to Scandinavia, where he was arrested and held prisoner until he died in 1578. In 1568, Mary managed to escape from Lochleven, but her army was defeated at the Battle of Langside in May. Without friends in Scotland, Mary fled to England in the belief that her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, would support her. But Mary was too dangerous as the Catholic contender for the throne of England, and instead Elizabeth imprisoned her for 19 years. In England, Mary became the centre of Catholic plots to put her on the throne. How much she knew or encouraged such treason is unknown. Elizabeth was unwilling to execute her, but following Mary's almost certain involvement in the Babington plot to assassinate Elizabeth, even the Queen could no longer ignore her minister's advice to remove Mary altogether. Mary had her head chopped off at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire in February 1587. She was 44, initially buried in Peterborough Cathedral, but her son James VI had her remains removed to Henry VII's chapel in Westminster Abbey. Roger the Great was born the son of Merthin Frich, the King of Gwynedd, and Nest Furch Cadel from the royal house of Powys. Roger was born in about 820, but unfortunately very little is known about him. He inherited the kingdom of Gwynedd from his father in 844, and then Powys from his uncle in 855. He married Angharad of Seyselvig and inherited her family lands when her brother Gwygon of Seyselvig drowned in 872. Rhodri then ruled most of Wales, and this was the era of the Viking raiders who ravaged the entire British Isles, and Rhodri's kingdom was under attack, with one particularly damaging raid on Anglesey in 854. The other constant threat was from his Wessex neighbours. Rhodri was a great warrior, won a famous victory against the Danes in 856 when he killed the Danish leader Gorm. This won him international acclaim and attention. Rhodri now ruled from Anglesey to the Gower Peninsula. He wasn't so successful in 876 in another battle on Anglesey against the Danes and had to flee to Ireland. He returned the following year and was probably killed in battle against Alfred the Great, and his sons Anawad, King of Gwynedd, and Powys and Cadel, King of Seyselvig, in time had to submit to Alfred the Great and acknowledge him as their overlord. To be descended from Rhodri More's bloodline became the most important qualification to rule Wales. And here's a statue of Llewellyn the Good, who was better known as Llewellyn, was the grandson of Rhodri the Great and was born in about 880, but whereabouts were unknown. In 905, his father, Rhodri, gave him newly conquered Dyfed to rule on his behalf. As part of the settlement, Llewellyn married Alpin, the daughter of Llynedd ap Hyfed, the former ruler of Dyfed, to apologise to any Welsh speakers here for murdering the pronunciation here. When Cadel ap Rhodri died in 909, Llewellyn inherited part of Seyselvig kingdom in South Wales, Ceredigion and Ystrad, and then when his brother Cledog died in 920, Llewellyn created the new kingdom of Deheubarth in southwest Wales. In 930, he added the Brycheiniog, and then Powys, and then finally Gwynedd, where his cousin Eadwulffoel died in battle against the English in 942. He was now king of all Wales. He was contemporary across the border in England was Aethelstan, who he pragmatically acknowledged as his overlord and to whom he paid tribute, and they formed a strong alliance and probably even a friendship, and in any event they jointly ruled parts of Wales. Llewellyn became the first Welsh ruler to mint his own coins at Chester in England in over 1,000 years. Particularly interested in law and legal systems, he even visited Rome in 928, and on his return produced his own law book. In 954, the Whitland Conference codified Welsh law and wrote it down for posterity. It wasn't abolished until the 16th century. When he died, his kingdom included all of modern Wales, except what is now Glamorgan and Gwent. It wasn't to last. When Llewellyn died, the kingdom was split into three. Deheubarth divided between his sons, and Gwynedd reclaimed by the sons of Eadwulffoel. We now have Griffith of Llewellyn, who was the eldest son of the ruler of Gwynedd and Powys, and his wife Angharad, and instead of inheriting his father's kingdom on his death in 1023, it went instead to Iago ap Idval, who ruled until being killed by his own supporters. In 1039, possibly the connivance of Griffith. Meanwhile, he'd taken power in Powys and seized this opportunity to take Gwynedd on Iago's death. He was aggressively intent on extending his kingdom. He was well known to be ruthless and bloodthirsty, attacked and took neighbouring Deheubarth from Llewellyn ap Ivan in about 1043 at the Battle of Abertiri, but was driven out again in 1047 by Griffith ap Rhydderch of Gwent. Next, he attacked towns along the Welsh border around Herefordshire, and in 1055 the two Griffiths met in battle, with Griffith ap Llewellyn killing Griffith ap Rhydderch and retaking Deheubarth. With his new English ally Ulfgar, son of the deposed Earl of East Anglia, he marched on Hereford and there defeated the Earl of Hereford. The victors sacked the city and destroyed the castle. Soon after, Ulfgar was restored to the earldom and a peace treaty was agreed. In addition, he married Eadgulf, Ulfgar's daughter, and in 1055 Ulfgar became Earl of Mercia and an even more powerful ally for Griffith. Back in Wales, he took Morgannwg and Gwent by force and much of the Welsh border country and claimed his sovereignty over Wales, reached an accord with Edward the Confessor, who recognised his authority. But his old ally Elfgar died in 1062, leaving Gruffydd's position exposed, and his vulnerability was recognised by Harold Godwinson, who made a surprise midwinter attack with support from southwestern Welsh fighters on Gruffydd's court at Rhuddlan. He was warned to escape just in time, and in the following spring Harold attacked South Wales, while his brother Tostig took his army into North Wales. He fled to Sodonia, where he and his men were trapped, and on August the 5th, 1063, Gruffydd was killed by his own men and his head sent to Harold as proof of his death and a sign of their submission. In revenge, because the Ulster Chronicle stated that Gruffydd was killed by Sinan ap Iago, in revenge for the killing of his father, Iago Idwal, in 1039, Gruffydd's kingdom split back into their traditional disunity instead of his eldest son Dafydd, and his widow Elfgarth married Harold Godwinson. He had Llewellyn the Great. Llewellyn was the son of Iardaith ap Arwain of the ruling family of Gwynedd and Margaret, daughter of Madoc ap Margaret, Prince of Powys, and was probably born at Dolwyddelyn. During his childhood, Gwynedd was divided between his uncles Dafydd and Rhodri, but Llewellyn was also a good claim, and it's probable that he was fighting them for Gwynedd as early as 1188. 6 years later, and with the help of his cousins, he defeated his uncle Dafydd in battle at Aberconwy, and then Rhodri died in 1195. Llewellyn took the lands east of the Conwy, and his cousins took the lands west. Under Rhys, the Dyrbarth had been the strongest Welsh kingdom, but on his death it was split up, leaving Llewellyn an opportunity to establish himself as the strongest independent Welsh leader. And by 1199 he'd captured the castle of Mold and was calling himself the Prince of the whole of North Wales, an exaggeration until his cousin Gruffydd died in 1200, leaving Llewellyn the undisputed leader. In July 1200 he made a treaty with King John of England and swore fealty to him, the earliest known written agreement between the rulers of England and Wales. And the treaty confirmed Llewellyn's conquests and allowed him to hear lands claim under Welsh law. His main court was at Garth Cullen in North Gwynedd, and it remained the effective capital of Wales until medieval times. Llewellyn's principal rival was Gwenwyn ap Olwen, Prince of Powys, and self-proclaimed leader of the Welsh Princes. They both desperately wanted each other's possessions, but neither was strong enough to take the other. Until 1205, Llewellyn strengthened his status by marrying Joan, the illegitimate daughter of King John of England. 3 years later, King John argued with Gwenwyn and had him arrested and his lands confiscated, and then turned a blind eye when Llewellyn took southern Powys and northern Ceredigion for himself. But the way of thanks, Llewellyn joined King John in his campaign against William I of Scotland in 1209. The following year, John and Llewellyn fell out, and the former sent his army to invade Gwynedd with the support of most of the other Welsh rulers. He was finally forced to come to terms, and thanks to Joan's intercession with her father, he was not totally dispossessed. He lost all his lands east of the River Conwy, handed over hostages, and agreed to pay huge tribute of 20,000 cattle and 40 horses. He had to agree to leave all his lands to the King of England if he died without a legitimate heir by Joan. The other Welsh princes also reneged on their reliance with John and turned to Llewellyn. Pope Innocent III had placed John and England under interdict and was only too delighted to release all the Welsh princes from their vows of allegiance to John. By 1212 he'd recovered almost all of Gwynedd, and by 1213 he took the castles of Duncanwy and Rhuddlan. Then he allied himself to Philip II of France and to the barons rebelling against King John, marched on Shrewsbury and captured it. He then held South Wales and captured much of Mid Wales, and when King John signed the Magna Carta, Llewellyn received more powers and became indisputably the strongest ruler in Wales and the leader of the independent princes of Wales. In 1216, in council at Aberdofi, Llewellyn took pledges of allegiance as overlord from his fellow Welsh princes, and adjudicated on a number of land claims and rewarded his supporters. By 1270, King John was dead, and Henry III was on the throne of England. Llewellyn concluded the Treaty of Worcester with a new king, which confirmed him in all his conquests. Nevertheless, battles and arguments erupted as the lesser Welsh princes continued to swap sides and manoeuvre for advantage, and Llewellyn was frequently fighting with and against them, the king and marcher lords. Between 1220 and 1230, Llewellyn built a number of large stone castles to defend its borders, including Dolderbarn and Criccieth, and in 1230 changed his title to become Prince of Aberfraw and Lord of Snowdon. The fighting ended in June 1234, when Llewellyn and Henry concluded the Peace of Middle, a 2-year truce which was continually renewed until 1240. Llewellyn only had one legitimate son, Dafydd, whom was determined he would inherit his kingdom. He got the King of England's support for this, that of the Pope, and in 1238 he made the other Welsh princes to swear fealty to Dafydd. In 1237 Joan died, and Llewellyn was partially paralysed by stroke, so Dafydd took on much of the process of government. He died aged 68 and was buried at the Abbey of Aberconwy in 1240 and succeeded by Dafydd. So here we have Dafydd, Griffith, and this is Llewellyn the Last. This isn't Dafydd because Dafydd died in 1246 without leaving an heir, sorry. So Llewellyn's father Griffith was the second son of Llewellyn the Great, and when the latter died in 1240, Griffith and his brother Owen were sent as prisoners to England by his uncle Dafydd, the new Welsh king. 4 years later, Griffith died while trying to escape from a high window at the Tower of London. With his father dead and no longer a prisoner of King Henry III, Llewellyn could fight alongside his uncle against the English, and in February 1246 Dafydd unexpectedly died without an heir, and Llewellyn and his uncle Owen made a truce with Henry, in which Gwynedd was divided between them. Years of fighting followed, with Llewellyn gradually extending his territories. In 1267, in the Treaty of Montgomery, King Henry recognised Llewellyn as Prince of Wales, in return for which he had to pay hefty tribute. But Welsh rivalries were never still, and Llewellyn was never as strong again. When the new English King Edward I invited him to his coronation, and then summoned Llewellyn to pay homage to him at Chester in 1275, he refused both times and made himself a powerful enemy. In 1276, Llewellyn was declared a rebel, and a price was put on his head. Edward assembled an army of some 15,600 soldiers, including many of the lesser Welsh princes who resented Llewellyn's authority. Trapped and surrounded by enemies, Llewellyn had to sign the Treaty of Aberconwy to guarantee peace in Gwynedd. In addition, he had to pay homage to Edward and was stripped of the majority of his conquests. The situation was quietened but not settled, and in 1282 many of the Welsh princes revolted, Llewellyn eventually joining them. The English army returned to Wales. After prolonged fighting across Wales, Llewellyn was killed, either by treachery or possibly by chance, which separated from his army at Earthon Bridge near Bullif Wells. His corpse was beheaded, and the head sent to Edward at Rutland, and then on to London, where it was paraded for the crowds to jeer at, then mounted on a pole at the Tower of London. And lastly, we have Owen Glyndwr. Here is a statue of him, one of the 6 children of Gruffydd Fechan II and his wife Elin. Glyndwr came from a prosperous Anglo-Welsh family in the Welsh Marches of northeast Wales. His father died while Owen was about 16, and the boy was sent to London to study law at the Inns of Court, probably for about 7 years. By 1383, Glyndwr had returned to Wales and married Margaret Hannah. Head became the squire of Sycharth and Glyndwr Fedri, and Glyndwr is thought to have fathered some 15 children. In 1384, Glyndwr entered the English king's service, doing garrison duty on the English-Scotland border at Berwick-on-Tweed, and in the following year fought in France, Scotland again, and England. In 1387 he returned to Wales when his father-in-law died and served as a squire to Henry Bolingbroke, who was later Henry IV, at the Battle of Radcott Bridge. After military service, Glyndwr lived quietly for 10 years. However, he had a long-running dispute with his Norman neighbour Baron Grey de Ruthyn, in which King Richard and the courts found for Glyndwr. But on the accession of Henry IV, Baron Grey used his friendship with the king to overturn the verdict, and crucially did not inform Glyndwr of his royal summons to join the king's Scottish campaign. By not appearing, Glyndwr unknowingly committed treason. Unaware of the deception, King Henry declared Glyndwr a traitor and his lands forfeit, and made Grey his agent. Glyndwr had no option but to revolt and fight. On September the 16th, 1400, Glyndwr was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his followers. He certainly had the best claim to the Welsh throne. The revolt swiftly and successfully spread through northeast Wales and then south. By 1401, north and central Wales belonged to Glyndwr. In response, Henry appointed Harry Hotspur, to stifle the revolt, and issued an amnesty to all the rebels except Glyndwr. Glyndwr's first big victory was at the Battle of Midkib in 1401, and the revolt looked likely to spread. Hotspur wanted to negotiate and stop the repression, but anti-English and anti-Welsh feelings intensified on both sides. And in 1402, Glyndwr ambushed and captured Baron Grey de Ruthyn, who he then ransomed and in the process ruined financially. In 1403, and with help from the French, the revolt spread across the whole of Wales. Experienced French soldiers left English service to join the rebellion, as did Welshmen from all over Britain. And in 1403, Hotspur changed sides to support Glyndwr and challenge Henry IV's right to the throne, but he was killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury, alongside some 20,000 dead or injured. In 1404, Glyndwr captured Harlech and Aberystwyth castles, called his first Parliament, and was crowned Owen IV of Wales, started negotiating with disaffected English lords, notably Edmund Mortimer and the Earl of Northumberland, and signed a treaty with the French that promised aid from France. Meanwhile, Breton, Irish and Scots raiders took the opportunity to wreak havoc around the English coastline, and in 1405 a French expeditionary force arrived at Milford Haven and joined up with the Welsh forces in South Wales. They met the English army near Worcester. There was a standoff for 8 days without any fighting, and then both sides withdrew, the French and Welsh returning to Wales under cover of dark. By 1406, most of the French had returned to France, and the Welsh were losing to the English. And under the command of Henry of Monmouth, trade, weapons and supplies were slowly but surely denied the rebels, and Glyndwr's supporters negotiated their own surrender terms. Despite appeals to the French, no help came, and members of Glyndwr's family were captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where they all died. Glyndwr was a hunted man, with only scattered outposts to support. The last known sighting of him was in 1412. The following year, Henry V took the throne, and with it pardons for a number of the rebels and a less harsh attitude towards the Welsh. Huge rewards were posted for Glyndwr, and in 1415 a pardon was offered to him. But nothing was heard from him, and his fate remains a mystery, although he may have spent his last years in England with his daughter and her English husband in Herefordshire. And that concludes this lovely book, taking us through the monarchy of not only England, but of Scotland and Wales, which I wasn't expecting as an extended appendix. So, thank you very much for joining me on this read-through. I hope you've enjoyed and been informed by the entire history of the British monarchy. I look forward to having you join me next time. But until then,